What's up, guys? How was everybody doing on Sunday? Hurting feelings lately. It's not been the intent, but we'll see. All right, we're going to jump right into it. Don't know how long this is going. But what's up? Softly, no one's coming on tonight. Just going to hear me talking about some things as kind of like the first of a bunch of different lives I think I'm going to do where we'll talk about CQB, centered around training, and training it and standardize kind of what I feel like. Let me caveat all this too. This is my view of CQB based off of, my experience over my career. If yours is different, then you'll have a different view. If your understanding is different than what mine is, then you'll have a different one. I feel confident that I'll can talk about this in a live format with anybody. So, I believe in this stuff. I feel like I'm constantly trying to prove or disprove, things that I know to be true to myself on the training side, just to make sure that everything is being done as efficiently as it can. I think anytime we talk about CQB, we've got to standardize some language. You guys are throwing a bunch of questions up here. I'll get to some of these, man, so just hold them off. Let me get through this first part, and then I got a lot of good questions from people. A lot of not so good questions too, which isn't surprising. So I think anytime we talk about CQB, we have to standardize the language so that dudes can actually talk about it, because there is so much fucking misinformation. Not like purposeful misinformation. Honestly, I think it's because dudes don't understand what they're talking about or what they're training. The most recent one was the video from the Sheepdog guys and their nonsense plating the fucking doorway and then doubling down on, well, this is what the highest level guys do. And it just shows like you don't have an understanding about what the high level guys do. So we can have this conversation. I think standardizing the language so we're all talking about the same thing. When we talk about, CQB and TTPs kind of go hand in hand. TTPs, not to insult anyone's intelligence, but tactics, techniques, and procedures. So CQB is the tactic, like full stop. CQB is the tactic when you talk about, close quarters fighting, close quarters battle, CQC, depending on what branch you're at, close quarters combat. And it is not something that is specific to inside a house. It's any time you're in confined space. It can be urban. It can be around vehicles. It can be in courtyards. It could be any time that you're fighting, enemies or adversaries in confined space. You're using CQB, right? That is the tactic. Now, when it comes to what we use to prosecute that tactic, whether it's going to be POD, strong wall, limb pen, the two-man hoot scoot special, whatever type of made-up shit you have been taught or that is your technique that you use, right? Points of domination is what I've primarily used, although throughout my entire career, and even to this day, you practice all of them. You have to have I think if you want to teach this stuff, you want to understand it at the highest level, you have to be good at all of it. You have to understand what it entails to execute strong wall aggressively, what it entails to execute limb pen aggressively. I don't think, there's pros and cons to each technique that you would use, right? Like, for example, points of domination is the most confusing for an adversary inside the room because you're setting up an L shape. It's where if you 4 guys or even 2 guys, the sectors of fire are opened up as big as they possibly can be, and they all interlock. So you can have as many guns into the fight as possible. And that's one of the positives of points of domination, right? You're setting up an L-shaped ambush in every room. One of the negatives of it is it leverages very heavily on individual skill, and that's something that quite frankly in any training world, people get into CQB and they ignore the fact of the point of performance of work of what fucking happens in that room. It's a close, very, very fast gunfight that has to be absolutely precise, right? So points of domination leverages heavily on individual skill. Very simple method of entering, very simple on how you actually would write an SOP for points of domination. It's literally under a minute explanation, right? For a corner fed room, the 1 and 2 man take 1 corner each. The 3 and 4 man go half the distance between the breach point and the guy that they followed. That's a corner fed room. Center fed room, the 1 man takes 2 corners, the 2 man takes 1 corner, the 3 and 4 man go half the distance between the man that they followed and the breach point. That's the technique, right? That is what you would have to memorize to understand how to do points of domination. When entering the room, you go opposite the man in front of you. If you make a mistake and you follow the guy in front of you, then the next guy corrects the mistake, right? Very simple to understand, very simple to explain, very, very difficult to execute. Strongwall, one of the big benefits of Strongwall CQB is that everyone is on the same wall and all the fires are directed in one area, right? Can be very, very lethal to an adversary. And at the same time, it's very, very safe for the individuals that are executing that technique because all of the fire is directed one way. One of the negatives is all the sectors of fire don't interlock. So typically 4 guys, if they're all in the right position on the strong wall, cannot engage everything across the room. So you kind of have guys that are fighting on the left side and guys that are fighting on the right side potentially. That would be a negative of it. And I think also too for Strongwall, it lends itself to more, kind of esoteric debates on what the doorway procedure is, because if you're in a corner fed room, which wall is the strong wall, right? Is it the path of least resistance? Does the 1 man set it? If it's a center fed room, is it obviously it would be the wall that the door is on, but in a corner fed room, there's decisions that you have to make. And I think that relies heavily on what's happening in the back of the stack, that guys understand what's unfolding in front of them so that they're able to find the proper position in the door. And that would be classic strongwall. What I think when people do strongwall, what happens a lot of times is they're making a lazy L, right? They don't over penetrate in the room, but in order to simplify the doorway procedure, they end up in a kind of a lazy L. And then limb pen is a technique, typically built around a 2-man clear. And it's actually, limb pen or high threat CQB is designed for very low skill level patrol officers to give them a method to search buildings. That comes from straight out of the mouth of the guy that kind of brought that to industry and coined the phrase limited penetration. It's built off of a combat clearance, methodology that was used in the military, quite successfully for a number of years. But again, like anything that's copied from the military, lack of understanding of what they're doing and conditions that had to be met to use combat clearance, or a limited penetration type technique are typically never met, right? So that understanding loses. But whatever technique you use, it's going to be unique to the team, unique to the individuals that are executing that technique, and obviously the deeper the reservoir of skill becomes, the more that you're able to do in terms of performance. Now, when we talk about threshold assessments, anything dealing with the obscure footwork, barrel wags, communications, doorway procedures, any of that falls under procedures, right? And those are procedures that are utilized within a technique that support a tactic, right? So when I say TTPs, that's how I'm looking at it. And again, the tactic of CQB, in my opinion, is not unique specifically to the house. It's become that way when we talk about it, but it's any time you're fighting in confined spaces. It can be around vehicles, it can be just in the open, but an adversary is close, right? So when we talk about what supports the tactic, and we have to talk about the principles, right? And the principles are 3 principles of CQB, and they're in this order for a reason. It is surprise, speed, and violence of action. Surprise is obviously self-explanatory. You want to, attack or start the fight, on your own terms in an offensive nature, and utilize surprise to your action. A lot of times when we talk about law enforcement, even in the military, you willingly give up surprise, whether it's through audible signature or a legal procedure thing that you have to do before entering. So once we lose surprise, we leverage the next tactic or next principle, which would be speed. If they know we're there, then we're going to leverage speed to be successful in the execution of whatever technique we use. When there come times on plenty of assaults or plenty of warrant services where you're not able to leverage speed, you're not able to be fast and be aggressive in the execution of your technique. So you use violence of action, which for me, if I was king for a day, whenever this shit was written, I would have, instead of using violence of action, I would have used initiative. But it means the same thing. It's don't get wrapped around the violence part of it. It's using initiative gaining tools to gain back leverage so that you can now go back and leverage speed. In the law enforcement world, those are limited in terms of what they're able to use. It's unique to specific teams. In the military, I think it's a little more standardized, and it's a little broader across the spectrum of what you can use as initiative gaining tools, whether it's, interior charges, flashbangs, offensive hand grenades, dogs, very similar tactic that law enforcement uses with the port and covers, breaking windows and banging exterior. We have the same the ability to make windows in the military anywhere on a structure, right? And that would be an initiative gaining tool when we're running into somebody who is actually in a defensive fighting position in a room or truly barricaded. So those are the principles that support the tactic of CQB. The way that I look at it, techniques support the tactics while adhering to the principles, and procedures support the techniques while supporting the principles. Right. And that's how I kind of, phrase or think about this stuff or conceptualize it when I'm talking about it. Next thing I think we got to talk about is there is obviously a definite trend where guys like to use words and believe that they mean one thing when in fact they don't mean that. And no matter how many, I think it's something that's happened, over time where just because you say it and nobody talks shit or laughs at you does not make it true. It's kind of the rule. If I say it 3 times and nobody challenges it, it becomes real. All right. And that's kind of the dynamic versus deliberate. Dynamic does not mean fast. And deliberate does not mean slow. I think any warrant service or military anything any operation or action that you're going to conduct that you have any level of planning is a deliberate assault, or it's a deliberate raid, or it's a deliberate service, however you want to look at it. It doesn't mean slow. So when you talk about dynamic, I think to me, you're talking about the environment, in the definition, you can look it up. Dynamic talks about a fast, aggressive, ever-changing environment, that's chaotic in nature, right? And I think that could describe a lot of different things that law enforcement, military guys face in terms of the environment. I can't remember a time when doing CQB, we're like, hey, we're going to hit this dynamically. We'd hit targets hard, and then there were times to go fast, and then there were times when we didn't go fast, and we understood what the conditions had to be present for us to not go fast. And We'd utilize the right technique based off the conditions at the right time. Yes, it is Gatorade. Feeling a little under the weather right now. So when we talk about using the right technique at the right time based off conditions, what conditions have to be present to conduct an aggressive assault versus a slow, methodical assault? And I think if you talk about the military side of this, we're always going to leverage to fighting at full speed and have an aggressively executed technique, that supports whatever tactic, whatever the environment is, but we want to close with and destroy. You want to fight at full speed, not in slow motion. There's times where we can maintain surprise for longer, and there's no conditions, nothing about the target that's driving you to go in there and hit it hard, and the conditions are there. Typically, it's pitch black, and it's done under nods with, infrared lasers, and then the walls have to be able to stop bullets. So if you find yourself in that situation, then by all means, spend the rest of your life pieing the doorway to assess what's outside that room. It's works very, very well when the guys on the inside do not have nods or have a way to see you. But I think for those conditions, like a lot of that stuff comes from the combat clearance, doctrine that we were very, very good at executing. But those conditions typically are not present in law enforcement. They're not present in the United States unless you're in a very, very rural area. There's always going to be some level of backlight, right? And then if you're clearing under nods where it's not completely dark, right? The biggest thing to defeat those nods is a fucking handheld bright flashlight. So understand that you have to use the right technique at the right time. So to be slow and methodical, we have to have conditions that are in our favor that mitigate some of the risk, right? Obviously, the number one risk mitigation tool in anything that is CQB related, that is fighting at close distance, is individual skill, right? But a lot of times when you see videos on the internet of guys demonstrating CQB or whatever, there's not a lot of individual skill there, right? As the mitigating tool, right? You want accountability, control, and performance in the highest parts, and they all have to be equal, right? That's the way that I look at it. So we'll leave it there. When we talk about standardizing some of these definitions, that's how I look at it. It's my view of it. And I'm not going to obviously have techniques that I'm going to utilize when I have the ability to plan a target and a team and run a team, and we're going to hit it a certain way, right? It's not going to be a cookie cutter every time it's this way. It is going to be based off of the conditions that are present, that we are going to be successful, executing that. But the execution speed, it has to be aggressive, right? In combat sports, in any sport really, where there are two opponents that are going against each other, and throw it in the comments if I'm completely overlooking this, but is there anything that values going slow to win? And I can't think of one, especially in the combat sports, right? There's times to go slow and there's times to be aggressive, right? But if one guy is trying to fight at half speed and the other guy is fighting at full speed, regardless of whatever sport they're in, I think the outcome generally lends itself to the guy that is fighting at full speed, right? And I know we've got plenty of black belts in here and plenty of combatives guys that can talk about that. Reading a couple of these questions. Okay, the question about best way to run a safety / grading structure, shoot me a DM. That's way too long of a topic. So we got some questions here to go over. Some good ones. Well, you guys are trying to get me fired up. Where does high ready come from? Yeah, the guy who applies slow is smooth and smooth is fast to MMA. He does not win very many MMA matches. You know, so when we talk about using the right technique at the right time, we have that, you know, planning, how are we going to execute it? We can only execute, you know, any operation that requires CQB, regardless of the technique, based off the lowest level of collective skill that we have on a team. So if that is low, you are going to do some low level shit. Like, that's just the way it is. And that's a hard thing for guys to look at. If you think that you are going to pie a doorway at a 45, a 90, a backside 45, right, and then poke your head in there in the middle of the fucking day in drywall walls to a guy that decides, because it's taking you forever to do that finally decides, now I'm going to fight the cops. That outcome only looks one way, right? You can believe me or not believe me, but you're going to learn lessons that we all learned, and you're going to learn them the same way we learned them. So it's very, it's kind of very disparaging to see that, right? I was recently having a conversation with a medic that I work with. I can't remember. Let me get this right. So there's a thing in medicine that's called the Walker dip, and it was coined by a surgeon, where they looked at in times of war when a lot of casualties were happening, and you saw this from kind of '04 to '07. If you were ever around Baghdad, the 31st Cash, you know, there was a huge fast forwarding in terms of medical skill for our country, right? Doctors, general surgeons that weren't even board certified were getting so many reps of surgeries, things that they would never see over an entire career, they're seeing in like a year's time on a 1-year rotation. Now, when the wars stop or the fighting stops and the casualties decrease, there's a natural dip in terms of skill, because you're not exercising that skill over and over, right? It's specific to medical training when you talk about it, because the guy that coined it, his last name, he was a surgeon, his last name was Walker, but it's noticeable and it's something that you can track. So think of that in terms of, we went through this 22-year-long war, you know, lots of fighting, lots of targets, you know, all the different levels of the tiers. Everybody, you know, was all trying to, you know, kind of get their war on, and we were all trying to do the same thing. A lot of guys believed we did the exact same thing, you know, and now that goes away. There is no really active fighting for most of the white side soft guys right now. You know, there's still components of higher level tiers that are doing stuff, and there's still components of the government that are very, very busy. But by and large, the core soft elements and infantry guys are not being exercised appropriately. So there's going to be a dip in terms of what they're able to do. And I think that's natural. The scary part for me, you know, having sons in the military, is that the lessons that were learned have almost exclusively been forgotten. Not to mention the type of man that exists today in the infantry is completely fucking different than the type of man that existed in, you know, the early 90s to late 90s or right before GWAT. That's a fact. You can see it. You walk anywhere in the 82nd Airborne at fucking Pride Month, and the CQs are decorated with pride flags and everything. That's just the nature of the political environment, and there's bleed over effects. The dudes are fucking softer. They just are. No matter how much scientific approach you put into training, and physically you could be, they're lifting more or whatever, it's still undetermined if the longevity cycle is going to be there, if they're going to be less injured at the end of a career. But I'll tell you, the way that I was brought up, 26 years, you know, zero musculoskeletal injuries, zero neck problems, knee problems, shoulder problems, nothing. So I feel pretty confident in the way that I was trained and the guys that trained it, right? And the mentality that they bred in us. You don't see that. So when we talk about training CQB and the mentality with any of it in terms of executing a warrant service, a point target, whatever operation you're doing, the execution speed should be very, very aggressive, right? But with that, you have to have willingness for guys that aren't talking exclusively about officer safety, exclusively about what if this, what if that, what if you just went in and smashed this fucking house and were technically perfect in whatever technique you were applying. I bet you the outcome would look different. If you had skills and abilities to support that level of execution, that high level execution, empirical data, my historical firsthand information, you will be successful and be alive to tell a ton of stories about executing targets that way, but that's getting lost. And there's now this whole industry. There's an entire industry of guys teaching something that, in my opinion, they don't fucking understand. Go on YouTube, just watch the videos. They just don't understand what they're trying to accomplish, and it leads into the good idea fairy, right? And then there's this major desire to be novel, right? To be unique. So they have to have a gimmick. I got a question about running the rabbit. That is a completely made up fucking thing from influencers that talk about to describe what a one man does as, oh, well, when are we going to use the technique of running the rabbit? Fucking never. At no point in my entire career, and even to this day, do I sit with very serious dudes that are talking about, okay, we're going to run the rabbit on this room. Like you're muddying the waters, right? You're overcomplicating something that doesn't need to be complicated. If you think of the environment and how that CQB exists in to apply that tactic, close in fighting, that is a very chaotic environment. Do I want the SOP to be very complicated, be 27 pages long versus barrel wags and commands and all this other esoteric bullshit? Or do I want it to be like 3 fucking slides that are pretty easy to understand that show me where I need to stand? It really becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I'm in a chaotic environment, I want the solutions to that environment to be very, very simple, right? So I look to principles, right? I look to leveraging principles, not individual techniques. And I think a lot of that is getting lost. Okay, this is a good one in here before I get to the ones that were asked. Any good PID drills, right? So by PID, I assume you're talking about positive identification or discriminating targets. So there's no drill, in my opinion, that's going to help you discriminate targets. Other than doing runs and training, shooting photographic targets. You could, in USPSA, there's a level of gross discrimination, right? It's brown, shoot with bullets, white, don't shoot with bullets. If it's got black on the target, don't hit the black part, only try to hit the brown part, right? That is one very basic rudimentary level of discriminating and processing, right? Where you have to shoot. Now with that comes a laundry list of other things you're trying to do on the hard skill side in terms of visual discipline and visual control. But the best thing I think you can do for getting guys to understand PID is give them a very concise process on how to do it, right? For me, the one that I use, that I've used for 20 years, is hands, demeanor, decision, right? That is the process that when I'm looking at a photographic target, demeanor, hands, decision. So I'm assessing the demeanor of the target, right? What is his physical stance? That's going to get you a long ways in terms of deciding what to do. I look at his hands Is he holding a weapon, something that's lethal? Demeanor in hands is where now I am deciding, do I shoot this dude or do I check up off of him, right? Demeanor, hands, decision. The decision point of it, demeanor and hands is what gets me to where, does this guy get bullets or not get bullets? The decision point is, where do the bullets need to go, right? And anytime actively clearing, right, that is a very fast process that I can go through, right? Demeanor, hands, decision. As fast as I can say it, I can do it on a target, right? And it gets you to where either he's going to get lethal action or you're going to check up on him and move, finish collapsing your primary, secondary, secondary depth, readdress him, whatever he needs in terms of verbiage. I mean, the list goes on and on in terms of contingencies. So I wouldn't say not a specific drill, but give guys a very simplified process that they're able to repeat over and over at speed. That's how I would do it. All right. Okay, I'll go with this first one. Given lack of training time, I think that's something universally that most officers experience, as well as the military. Is there an argument for limb pen or other techniques? In my opinion, no. So if you ever hear my explanation of, and I get the same feedback every time I run a CQB class, is after they've gotten everything, because we'll do glass house and give them bits of the technique, on day one and day two. And by halfway through day two, they're all like, this is so fucking simple. Why don't we do this? And I think it has to be simple. Now, if you've ever taken a class, if you live anywhere in Ohio and have had to go to Ohio Basic SWAT, they do limb pen, and you've seen a shoot house with all the fucking 45s and 90s and tape on the floor. It's a significantly more complicated technique. So now the way that I look at this, you're asking guys that have limited training time to do a more complicated technique. So no, that's fucking stupid. It doesn't make sense to do that. So something has to give. Simplify the technique or give more training time, right? There's no magic pill. You're not going to get, there's no magic pill. There's no magic technique where, oh, now we can have 8 hours a fucking month and be good at this. No, you can't. You cannot train CQB for 8 hours a month and that's all you do and expect that you're going to be successful or even good at it. What makes you successful in terms of law enforcement is no one fucking opposes you, right? But for teams that do train only 8 hours a month, and it's not exclusively CQB, there's a lot of other things that SWAT teams have to train. When they are opposed, typically they learn lessons, right? And they pay for those lessons in different ways. You can't do anything for 8 hours a month and expect to be good at it, right? Especially something like CQB where you're talking about fighting with guns at very close distances, right? At some point, you have to take your development into your own hands and you have to start doing some training on your own. What I would focus on, hard skills. Next question I got was vis laser to aim as you would IR, or use red dot for the main optic. I clear and shoot under the red dot, unless I can shoot through my gas mask on the red dot. I don't need the laser. Some guys do. To me, it's not ideal. I would say that's a suboptimal thing. If you have two guys entering a room and one guy's using a laser and the other guy's not, you're creating a distraction for the other guy while you paint the fucking entire room with that laser. I think it's a niche thing. In mop suits or lots of gear, lower optics, I could see that. But I have never been a fan of using the visible laser for targeting during the day. To me, I'm just going to shoot the main optic. What's your level of shooting need to be for HR or CQB in general? Like, what's the minimum? There is no minimum, right? This is another, I would put this into this is not really a very good question. This is somebody that wants validation about where they're at or what to do. In terms of foundational skills, you can never develop them enough for this. Let's start there, right? Shooting is, you can never be too fast, right? In the competitive world, you can never be too fast. You can never be too accurate. You can never be too precise and aggressive with your movement to where it's going to be a negative. Same thing holds true when you talk about any tactic that you're training. If shooting is the point of performance of work, then you can never be too good at it. The minimum level, I don't think you can really dictate that in the law enforcement world, because there is virtually no shooting standard in like a basic SWAT school, right? I think you have to shoot like a department qual and maybe another team qual or something to get on the team, and then you would go to like some sort of basic SWAT school. But I don't think that's not the minimum standard that you have to achieve. I think that is the entry fee you have to pay to get onto the team. Military does it a little bit better, you know, where they have hard and fast standards that you have to meet prior to even getting into some of the courses, whether it's Sephardic. So I think the minimum is you need to be, really, it's not going to be the answer, guys. Like, the minimum is you have to be safe with your guns, right? If you can't be safe, you can't do this. Then you have to, with a modicum of performance, you have to be able to make the bullets go where you need them to go, right? And then over time, you continue to develop and build on that skill, and it opens up new doors and avenues of things that you can do on the technique side, and how aggressively you can hit hit targets or warrants. For CQB, when you're training entry level guys, do you suggest progressive speed increases? Yes, obviously, that's a no brainer. There is, when you first start learning something, you have to do it at a pace where you can do it and be technically perfect, right? It's why we will start dudes in very clean shoot houses where there's nothing on the floor, because value finding very specific spots on the floor, the points of domination that you have to be in have to be exactly perfect initially. You have to ingrain that in guys the same way that before you even go into the house, right? Accuracy at speed is ingrained into you. You have to be able to be fast and hit the targets, right? That is a prerequisite for entering the house. So it does start small, and then a lot of times from a safety standpoint, you have calls that you have to make to come off the walls, and then as you progress and as that team progresses, they start to round the corners and they'll erase some calls, and you do it with visual cues, with the whole intent getting to where we want to get to a point where we go very, very fast and very, very hard and not have to talk about what we're doing. So yeah, obviously there's progressive increases in speed and performance. But also think about this. So when guys talk about, you know, the dynamic assault, which I fucking hate that term, but hitting something hard doesn't have a whole hell of a lot to do with how fast you move across the ground. The goal is, the faster I can move across the ground and effectively engage, the safer it's going to be for me in confined spaces. But what makes a team fast, or what makes a target go down fast, is your ability to go from one task to another task with no delay, right? From a procedural standpoint, there is no fucking delay. When the room is done, we are out of the room, right? Entering the room. We don't need to do elaborate procedures to open up a doorway. I've walked through 150 doorways today, and I've opened them all myself. So I'm going to build processes around that makes sense, and that value efficiency and performance pace over, extreme levels of safety that really, in reality, those dangers don't exist. I'm in a text thread that I put together that has a bunch of cops from all over the country that have trained. I've trained with at different times. They're all at some level of SWAT teams. They're running SWAT teams. They're leadership on SWAT teams. They're nugs on SWAT teams, or they're running firearms training units at different PDs. And they all talk. Tons of experience. Just the other day, added it up, got well over 500 years of combined experience. I asked them a question, because you hear this a lot, like, well, the one man getting shot in the face running through the door. And I asked every one of them, and guys from dynamic teams, there's deliberate teams, all through this group, has anybody been on a dynamic service or a no-knock service where the one man was shot and killed running through the door? And for 500 years of experience, the answer was resoundingly no. That has not happened to any of these guys on their teams or that they've heard of on their team. So we talk about, like, are we training for things that actually happening, or are we training in a way because you are fucking scared about what potentially could happen? And those are questions you have to ask yourself. I think it's guys are training because they're scared of what potentially could happen. Best way to mitigate fear is confidence in your skill. I don't know. I read that somewhere. Here's one. This is a question. And I know this is that a lot of teams don't have this, which blows me away, right? But I would consider this as like a no-brainer question, right? And it's kind of embarrassing that you have to talk about this. Should SWAT teams have an SOP, for CQB? Yeah, how the fuck do you train it if you don't have one? If you don't have a standard operating procedure, like, how the fuck do you train CQB? How do you convey information to a new guy that just gets there? He did the assessment, however long it was, and now you're on the team, right? And we all recognize, even full-time teams, you're going to have limited training time, at least limited contact time in a shoot house where you can convey information to this dude. So how do you get him spun up? The easiest way is he comes across the hall and you hand him a stack of papers, 4 to 6 papers, like, hey, this is the meat and potatoes of our SOP for conducting CQB, right? This is warrant service. This is the standard SOP, the technique that we use, right? And it's have a graphic in there and have very, very simple explanations about what each position does. Something that he can memorize, so when he shows up to the first training, you're not wasting a lot of time explaining things to him that you shouldn't have to explain. To me, it's a no-brainer. If you're on a team that doesn't have an SOP, I think you need to remedy that quickly. What's the most important fundamentals for CQB? Shooting and movement. Can anyone think of anything different? What would you value more than shooting and moving in CQB? I don't know. Shooting is the most important foundational skills. Shooting and movement. Did I do direct to threat prior to POD? No, direct to threat is some made up active shooter bullshit that alert or some low skill level fucking organization made up. There is no such thing as direct to threat when you deal with sectors of fire and doctrinally based tactics, right? That would be like we sit up in ambush and then one wild dick just decides to run and go directly to the shit we're trying to shoot. What would that do to all the sectors of fire? Would it make it more chaotic or less chaotic? Or would it make the potential for fratricide or for an accident to happen lesser or greater? The direct to threat shit is some dumb cop shit that was made up by guys who have never done this, right? With the idea being that we can just overwhelm a guy. But at the same time, going direct to threat, you want to be aggressive when you get in there and go directly to the threat, but we're going to do this fucking dick dance in the doorway and start on the left side, go to the right side. I'm going to clear all this stuff. And then this idea of plating a fucking doorway, mind-boggling retardness. Like, I don't understand any of that. Anybody that's worn plates will quickly understand there's a lot of places that you can get hit that aren't covered by that 8x10 plate. So I don't know what you're doing when you plate a doorway other than saying that dude's life is not as important as our lives. Doesn't make sense. I understand you have a gun in there as well, but you're standing in the most dangerous part of a structure, right? There's a name for that. I forget what it was, but I know it's not the blowjob zone. Dynamic versus limb pen for hostage rescue, stateside. You assume you're talking about for law enforcement. Let me answer that question with a question. Is a hostage rescue situation something that when you decide we're going to go physically rescue the hostages, is that something we can do slow? If you think the answer is yes, then by all means do limb pen. See how that works out. But to me, a hostage rescue is the fastest, highest level of aggression in terms of execution, and it is also the mission set that the individuals will assume the most risk because we are actively rescuing someone. That is ultimately what you get paid for, right? Like, you hear a lot of very dangerous conversations that happen within active law enforcement guys, right? There was one recently where he's like, yeah, if my buddy gets shot, that hostage doesn't fucking matter. Like, so your whole view of what your job is fucked up, right? You don't have the willingness to want to fight. You don't have the capabilities, because I think your capabilities, individual skills feed into the willingness, right? Feed into that mentality where you know, like, hey, I know I can win this fight. It's why, like, a professional MMA fighter is not stressed out in a bar full of people, right? Because he's confident and he knows what he can actually do. So those types of situations don't make him nervous. So is there a difference between building search and CQB? I would say yes, there is. With anytime you're conducting CQB, it's a team activity, and it's usually something that is planned, right? Even if it is like an emergency assault, I would say it is more of an offensive, or as offensive of an operation as an operation can get in the law enforcement world. From the military side, it's purely offensive. We're going to, it's basically a point target raid, precision raid. So yes, it's completely different than a building search, than an officer that responds to a building late at night and he has to search a building, and he's constantly calling out that the police are there. There's no, I think if they go in, if he would go in, there's generally, hey, yeah, there's a potential that I could encounter somebody, but the probability of coming in to armed resistance on something like that, I think would be at a minimum less than like a warrant service with whatever, criminals, pedophiles, drug dealers, who knows. So yes, there is a difference in my mind. Here's a good question. Can a perfect tactic, so a perfect technique, the right technique for the right conditions, be executed perfectly and still fail? Yes, 100%. There is no technique that supports CQB that is flawless, and if you do this, you win every time. Because the nature of what we're doing inside a structure is dangerous at face value, right? There is no way to make this shit safe. We mitigate risks through individual skill, and then we mitigate risks through common sense and by not doing dumb shit. That'd be the easiest way I could say that. But I do believe there's plenty of times I've been on targets where I feel like we did everything right, but when the shooting starts, there's guys 15 feet away, you're 15 feet away, depending on how many guys, and the shooting starts. It is a very, very fast, aggressive environment. You can do everything perfectly and still pay the price. The goal is you take that information back, you see, was this a failure in execution? Was this a failure of a technique? Was it a failure of how we apply the technique and application of the tactic, right? Did we miss something in planning? And I think more times than not, it comes down to it ends up being a failure of execution in terms of skill. But you can do everything perfectly and still get caught. I think that's just the reality of this business. Here's one, and I think assume this is more military. I mean, they're using military. Does IED CBRN threat significantly change dynamic approach on TTPs during CQB? No. The way you're going to execute it is based off of the information you collect. It changes it at some level in terms of how well practiced you are, because if you find yourself outside of a few very specific mission sets, but you're hitting a target in full CBR regalia, you really need to think about why you're hitting that target. And then also, typically, I don't see a lot of people defending targets in CBRN, like full MOP protections. So that's that. IED stuff, that would all be things that would come out in planning. If you're serving a warrant service and there's a guy like, hey, this guy's known to have devices that he can throw out Molotov cocktails or rudimentary devices that explode, and he has them all over his property, then I would say, yes, that is going to dictate how we plan for that. But in terms of execution, once we enter, I still believe there's one way to enter. If pressure plates are installed correctly, you're not going to see them. You're not going to see them fast, and you're probably not going to see them slow. It's why we have EOD guys that come up and find that stuff. So in terms of execution, if we have to get this target, we have to hit this guy or whatever, and there's these other possible contingencies or possible threats that are out there, it would only affect planning and how we would, peel this onion in terms of planning the assault. All right, that's all I'm going to go over that I got. Let's see what you guys are putting into the thing. Yep, I'll post this one up. Again, this will be kind of an ongoing conversation. I feel like it was important to standardize some definitions, and then as we continue, start picking it piece by piece. So you get this one a lot. Do you have more real-world examples of slow versus fast? Yeah, I'm sitting right in front of you. The vast majority of the shit I hit was fast and hard, and I'm still alive to tell about it, right? Stuff that was slow and methodical is because the conditions were there, and it was specific to certain parts of the world, right? Like, you apply a TTP in Afghanistan that works in, 18-inch, 2-foot thick adobe walls. That is not going to work in East Africa or Central Africa, where everything's made out of tin, right? So you wouldn't even consider, I'm going to apply this. I'm going to, assume a ton of risk and pie this doorway, right? When there's street lights, or if it's pitch black, now that becomes like, hey, we made this decision for this reason, and these were the conditions. But I think it has to be done where anyone inside that room cannot see you standing and delaying in the most dangerous part of the house, right, which is the doorway. So if you think of it like, I'll give this to you guys. So we'll end on this, right? In my opinion, there are 3 rules, and I challenge anybody to, set me straight on this, and we'll have a conversation about it. But there are 3 rules that you absolutely will never violate during CQB, right? And the first one is I am not going to stop in the most dangerous parts of the building, right? And that would be stairways, hallways and doorways, right? Stairways being the least, hallways being the second, doorways being um, the most dangerous, right? Because if typically U.S. commercial or U.S. residential construction, guy runs into a bedroom, there's one way into that bedroom, one way out. You know, barring it having like a Jack and Jill suite or Jack and Jill bathroom or some setup like that, there's typically, if someone wants to defend a room, there's one way to come in, and that's what he sets up on. The goal with minimizing and not stopping in the doorway is to give him the narrowest look in terms of engagement window, right? So we're never going to violate the rule where I'm going to stand and play fucking games in the fatal funnel, and I'm not going to stand and park myself and own a hallway and stay there. That's the last place I want to get into a fight. Same goes for stairwells. The second one would be is I'm never, when I'm in the room and I'm doing my, primary, secondary, and sector in depth, I'm never going to collapse to within 1 meter off of the first barrel I come to, right? That is a rule that exists from live fire in terms of training, which makes sense, and it also exists in the chaotic environment of 2 or 3 guys shooting at one guy inside a room, right? I don't want to sweep across him and collapse onto another guy, right? He has his own sector, right? And my sector ends at, I use 1 meter off the barrel. Some guys will say, okay, right to the barrel or a fist off the barrel. And I would say a fist off the barrel really quickly comes onto the barrel in that chaotic environment. And then the last rule that we are never going to violate is I'm going to stay 1 foot off the wall or obstructions that are on the wall, right? Like furniture on the wall. I'm not going to move out into the center of the room. I'm going to maintain moving to my point of domination 1 foot off the wall. And the reason that we don't violate that rule is because it keeps the sectors of fire open for everyone. If one guy moves 3 feet off the wall, he can shut down half the room. So now we took 3 guys or 4 guys into this room, and now only 1 or 2 of them can fight, right? So for that reason, we don't want to violate that. Now I understand in the law enforcement world, you hoarder houses and there's just paths, right? That you're confined to that path, but I'm still going to stay 1 foot off of, if it's got shit on the left, shit on the right, I stay to where I can move, right? And I keep it as open as I can. I'm not going to just kind of run onto the shit path in front of other people. The thing that can still stay the same is my sector. My primary sector still starts if I'm the one man in the near corner that I decide it starts in, because as we all have to agree, the one man is never wrong. He can go left, he can go right, and then the 2 man comes up opposite of him. So the sectors can all remain the same, but those are the only 3 rules that I would challenge, that we never violate those. Do we violate finding your exact point of domination? All the fucking time. You do it because of obstructions, you do it because the rooms are huge, and you collapse your sector, your primary so fast, like once you get to the end of your primary and you collapse your secondary, that becomes your point of domination. In terms of efficiency, it doesn't make sense for me to walk another 20, 30 feet down the wall. I have an L shape established, all the sectors are open. So I do violate that from time to time, or I bend that rule. But I'd be curious to hear what guys say when I put it up. Let's argue in the comments. I promise I won't block you. 10-hour training days once per month. How do you structure it? You structure it around what kind of your mission essential tasks are. Like, what do you do most likely? What is the highest percentage thing you do? What is the lowest percentage thing you do? And you dedicate that amount of training time to that, right? You got to have guys that have professional training mentalities and professional training methodologies to where they come in and work. Because as you know, like in any law enforcement, a 10-hour training day, how much training actually is accomplished in that? 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, a lot of time wasted in terms of inefficiencies from what I've seen in the past and from talking with other officers. All right. Lots of other good ones, man. This won't be the first one. Yeah, there's a big trend, short stocking rifles. Makes no sense to me. It's confined space, weapon maneuvering. It's something that you see in vehicles, not in shoot houses. It's been an hour. It's going to cut